Olá, sejam todos muito bem-vindos. O CNN Money recebe o especialista em futurismo Roger Spitz. Autoridade mundial em previsão estratégica e inovações de sistemas, ele dedica a carreira a aconselhar equipes de liderança e investidores sobre estratégias em relação a mudanças bruscas e também a imprevisibilidade. Autor do best-seller Disruptive Impact, que tenho aqui em mãos, o escritor sul-africano está de volta à CNN Brasil para conversar sobre tecnologias emergentes, também inteligência artificial, inovação e muito mais. Roger, thank you for accepting our invitation for this interview here in CNN Brazil.
My pleasure, Victor. Great to be back.
Roger, I'd like to start this conversation by discussing the concept of disrupt. How would you define this concept that is so used so often in your books and gives name to this one?
So, like many things, we often have preconceived ideas and they might evolve, right? So, I see three phases of disruption. Disruption, which I call disruption 1.0, which is in effect Joseph Schumpeter in institutional economic foundations, like in the 1950s in Europe, when it was rebuilding after the war, there was a process of creative destruction. There was destruction, very unfortunate, but somehow it built up cities, innovations, institutions, which went on from there, and there was some form of progress in that. And then I think most people, and I'm sure many or most of your listeners, will think about disruption from a maybe technocentric perspective. Innovation, product, markets, the Silicon Valley label for disruption. And a lot of that thinking is from the genius of Clayton Christensen around disruptive innovation. But disruptive innovation, I think, was very relevant and important in times where you could isolate specific phenomena. And you could say, okay, for instance, in Clayton Christensen's world, Uber is disruptive because, Uber is not disruptive because you're targeting the same target market, the same customers, but maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's an app, but actually you're targeting exactly the same customers.
But with another strategy, no?
Well, that distinction, you're right, is like for Netflix, Clayton Christensen would say, well, actually, Netflix is disruptive innovation because you're targeting a different market and then you're taking over the legacy, the incumbent player, the legacy player is trying something new. But we think things have evolved since then because in that definition, you can define what's disruptive innovation or what isn't. And to your point, what is a strategy? But they're often specific, isolated, understandable, replicable ways. And I think now disruption is systemic. In other words, you can't isolate a specific aspect. It's not just a technology, innovation, or product. It's systemic and it interacts with one another, creates further cascades and changes into something else. And I think the fundamental shift of what we call disruption 3.0 is that disruption is now systemic and it's moving beyond specific isolated phenomena, whether it's an innovation or product or anything else.
And when we talk about previsibility, I would like to understand how companies are prepared for the worst case scenarios. For example, I remember the pandemics. It was perceivable we would have such an event with so deep impacts in our society and, of course, our economy.
Yeah, so the different levels of thinking about prediction and predictability, right? I think the most fundamental is when the world is stable, linear, controllable, understandable, then I think you can apply the normal distinction between risk and uncertainty. So risk is, what is the variables, the probabilities. Uncertainty, the possible outcomes. You might not know the probabilities. Will there be a recession in the next 5 years? Will China become the first economy? Now, the challenge, I think, with predictability for companies, for economies, for everything, is when you move beyond uncertainty to deep uncertainty. And in deep uncertainty, you don't know the potential futures, you don't know the probabilities, you can't put a hierarchy, you don't know necessarily how to mitigate them, and you don't know how they might interact. And so that's what creates the systemic change and an inability to predict. So that is very different from uncertainty because there what happens is that they're knock-on effects. So an invasion of a country then creates food insecurity, then creates economic impact. power or energy security, social displacement, etc., or even a pandemic. So the challenge, I think, for companies is to realize that if they just think of uncertainty and try to predict the unpredictable, like predict and act, then they're making a bet on a specific strategy or outcome. And they're not thinking about other scenarios which might materialize in deep uncertainty. And so I think the challenge for companies is not so much to, or even economies like the central banks with inflation, not so much to seek to have a predict and then act model based on one assumption to the exclusion of everything else, but to understand how do you build in and accept that we're in systemic disruption, that there's deep uncertainty, that it is unpredictable, and then how do you nonetheless make decisions and move forward with the possibility of many outcomes you can't necessarily articulate or define.
Roger, in a timeline, do you think we are living right now a scenario that we live in this deep and I don't know how to put it, but a scenario that this imprevisibility is too high, it's freezing, for example, the companies to do some movements or building strategies, I don't know.
So it's a really good question, Victor, because it comes down to like decision paralysis, right? Is there so many possibilities or so many moving parts that we're just unable or unwilling to make those decisions? And I think we are definitely in what we call systemic disruption in our work, and we are definitely in that deep uncertainty. I actually think that organizations, individuals, and economies can build a new operating system, a new way of making sense and making decisions in that world. But it can't be the same business as usual. So let me give you a simple example. Take the interest rates and the central banks. The world and the central banks and Yellen and etc. didn't recognize that you were no longer in this sort of simple, isolated world, that it was systemic. So they predicted interest rates and they got it completely wrong. And we had the highest inflation for 50 years and they thought they could control it, but they couldn't. Now, there's nothing wrong with running the supercomputers. They have very good supercomputers, econometricians, statisticians, etc. The problem is when they assume the outcome of what the machine says to the exclusion of everything else, ignoring the interconnected knock-on systemic effect of change. So what does it mean? It means, for instance, very interestingly, Cleveland, as a central bank, decided on their own that they would stop recently making that assumption and relying on one specific outlook, but develop a broader sense of scenarios and possibilities so that if they get it wrong, because it's unpredictable, you will get it wrong. Basically, you have other flexibility, adaptive, anticipatory, and other ways of dealing with different outcomes, and you're not relying on that thing. So I think those companies that do not realize that different environment continue to sort of predict and act and make a bet on one specific outcome, they're either going to have decision paralysis or make the wrong bets, which will be very expensive in an asymmetric world, non-linear world. Those companies that understand that unpredictability is there, maybe it's not a problem per se, but you certainly need to behave differently in terms of decision making.
Roger, you were talking about central banks' decisions of interest rates. We see, for example, the central bankers using lots of data and lots of information. Yeah. How can AI be used by, for example, the central bankers or, of course, big companies to make these decisions, making this worst case scenarios again, the unpredictable, predictable, or actually maybe mitigate the effects of the things that are not we are not capable to predict.
Yeah, no, that's the crux, right? How is data helpful and how? And then what are the alternatives if it's not, right? So I think data, AI can be very helpful for things that are stable, linear, predictable. If you have known unknowns, it's a linear world. If there's an answer to the questions, you can rely on experts, you can have pattern recognition, and that's great. And That's why the AI is so good with drug discovery. That's why AI is helpful with some predictive markets on some specific narrow questions, like, what will happen to the economy. I think the challenge, coming back to the fundamentals of systemic disruption and deep uncertainty, is that if you are really in unknown, non-linear, asymmetric environments, which are simply unpredictable.
For example?
There's no data on the future. So, for example, and the examples I'll give, don't take them as individual because they interact. Climate. Will there be singularity, superintelligence, artificial general intelligence? Will you live and work in space? Will longevity be 150 years or 200 years? What is going to happen with the dynamics geopolitically, geoeconomically, geotechnology? How will all these things interact? Biotech developments, other AI developments, that implicates the future of work. Climate impacts the future of human migration, including in any country, Sao Paulo, New York, or city. So when you think about those, which is the deep uncertainty, the challenge is, number one, you can't look at them in an isolated way because they interact. And number two, they're simply unknowable. And the environment we're in, you might think you're making a decision that is more specific or more isolated, but you're going to be affected by this broader environment. And so here, to answer your question, I think you got to acknowledge in those deeply unpredictable environments, AI is not going to give you an answer because AI might give you an answer, but it's not able to better predict the unpredictable because there's no data on the future. So you need to use AI where it's good, which is maybe for real-time evaluation to inform possible future outcomes, but not to predict.
Okay.
So you see the difference is, am I using AI for descriptive analytics, for predictive perspectives that might inform future scenarios, or am I using AI for predictive capabilities and prescriptive decision-making? And so I think insofar as you're delegating decision-making to AI to predict the future, that is where you have a problem for the unpredictable because there's no data on the future. If you're using it as a feedback loop, as an adaptive feedback loop to inform future perspectives, then that can be helpful.
And many organizations, they say they are future ready. Are they?
I think personally, and I work a lot with boards and all kinds of organizations, that future ready has been conflated with technologically savvy, a little bit like innovation. Because I think that historically, innovation and disruption has been associated with new technologies. And I think if you look at a lot of the drivers of change, some are technological for sure, many are not. So I think to be future ready, personally, and our work at the Disruptive Futures Institute, you need three things. And you touched upon some of them earlier. One, you need resiliency, because you can't predict all the shocks. Or actually, we talk about Nassim Taleb's anti-fragile, which is resiliency plus. Resiliency, it doesn't get affected by shocks, it's resilient, but it doesn't improve. Nassim Taleb's anti-fragility actually improves with shocks. So you need anti-fragility because you can't predict the shocks and you need to be resilient plus. You need to be adaptive because things change. So you need some form of feedback loops to take in information. And there's some great models like Jakarta, how they manage extreme climate and that, for instance, with feedback loops and adaptive. And then you need to be anticipatory. Even though you can't predict, you need to think longer term. What are the next order implications? What are the things I'm not thinking about? If they cascade and continue, what could they affect? And so for me, future readiness, and I do a lot of work with the World Economic Forum as part of the Global Foresight Network. For me, future readiness is really, you're resilient for shocks you can't think about, that just happen. Real black swans, not false black swans. You're anticipatory in thinking about the longer term future, but you have the agility to constantly be adaptive with feedback loops around what's happening in the here and now. And without those three elements of resiliency, agility, and anticipatory, I don't personally believe that an organization, country, or person can really be future ready.
We're talking about black swans. In Future of Risk, a paper you wrote, you say rare events are becoming less rare. I do want to understand why.
Well, there's a why and there's what, for sure. So let's take isolated things, okay? So if you take, for instance, climate, if you look at the past 40 years of climate and you look at the data from NOAA, for instance, in the US, there used to be 2 to 5, at best, at most, annual extreme weather events that had a cost of higher than $1 billion. For the past few years, they've been basically close to 25, almost 2 per month. If you take events like economic shocks, erosions to democracy, if you take technological developments, if you look at how they interact with each other, basically these events, and look at the, probably you're better placed than me, but if you think about even from a CNN perspective of how many times over the past year or two have you said unprecedented? And if you're saying unprecedented every day, maybe we need to rethink when unprecedented becomes the norm. So what happens is that all these events, and this is just, not to mention wars, not to mention the breakdown of world order and some of the treaties, the World Trade Organization and others, tariffs, but it's not just a US thing. So when you look at all of these happening at once, often unrelated, you got to ask yourself, what is exceptional? Is rare really rare? And is unprecedented actually the norm? And then that becomes a question about how do you define risk and exceptional things, and why we believe that AAA is the only way to deal with this. Because if rare is less rare and unprecedented is the norm, you need resiliency, you need agility, you need to be anticipatory. You can't rely just on the predict and act, especially if it's unpredictable.
Roger, but events like wars, for example, or elections, of course, we're talking about the future, and the future is unpredictable. But based on experience, based on movies that we already saw, it's not. We are not capable to predict, for example, a party A or party B winning an election due economic data that we have, or that a war is going to close, I don't know, in a country because there is a dictator there. With these data, we can't predict and of course anticipate some decisions that we wouldn't if, of course, the world was in a place that this level of uncertain is quite down.
So I guess there are different elements. First of all, I think today with change, even war itself is being disrupted. So there's already a question of what is war? Because when you look at cyber, when you look at social media, when you look at geotechnology, geoeconomics, you're looking at many factors which you could consider to be a hybrid war. And you could consider that war itself is actually not that identifiable and clear-cut as to when it starts, finishes, or what it is, or who is involved. And that is a very important consideration, which is also feeding deep uncertainty, which is we move from a multi-pluralistic world where you find alignment and agreement, and it builds some degree of predictability and structure, whether it's trade organizations or United Nations or institutional. And you're moving to a multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, you might structurally have a different worldview, which are irreconcilable. You might have rules which are evolving, and you don't know what rules might be and who will be respecting them. And you might have different actors that are vying for dominance, state and non-state. So you see that even just war itself and the move from multipolar is creating dynamics of speed, of impact, of asymmetrical, of change that feed unpredictability. So I think there again, it comes to the importance of not relying too much on, history is important, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So to understand from history is very helpful. But to extrapolate as a kind of plug and play data, history, what's happening, this is what will happen. in this dynamic, liminal, hybrid world where everything is interacting, because I just looked at some elements around hybrid future of war, which might be happening now, but actually it touches upon society, economics, technology, geopolitics, healthcare, education, economies, trade, and that in itself is systemic.
Roger, you've written about meta-eruptions. I would like to understand this concept and how does it dialogue with this. We are where we are
Sure.
positioned right now.
Thanks for asking, Victor. And it's my way of trying to be provocative on a theme which people are taking time to understand, but need further provocation and tools to manage it, which is to deal with the unpredictability. And I think it was in 1982, John Nesbitt wrote a very important work called Meta Trends, and where he looked at what are the broad trends shaping the world. And when I looked at the things we're talking about and that we will write about and the frameworks to deal with that, I feel that trends is a little bit dangerous, because trends to a degree rely on the past, and it's a little bit of a rearview mirror. Even if they are separate mega trends, they are kind of written and described as if they interact in a predictable manner with one another, which one of the key things about systemic change and the deep uncertainty is that they interact with one another, but in an unpredictable way, creating cascades and transforming into next order implications. They're often quite technocentric. And so all of these things, I feel, lead people to rely maybe too much on predictability as if it was a stable, linear, controllable world. And the cost of that is expensive. So as a provocation, I thought, you know what, if you take meta trends or disruptions, let's think about meta-eruptions, which are change is a constant. It's unknowable. It's systemic. You might not have the answers. You need to ask yourself certain questions. What if something happens? And so meta-eruptions, it's just a slight provocation and play with words to not over-index and over-rely on trends. Every year in January, February, I'm sure you have 100 guests here. They go through on the latest trend reports, and there are many millions of pages on all these wonderful trends. And probably 80% of these trends are the same. Many might be short-lived. And the real question is that, are those the transformative changes that are defining the times ahead? Are those the things that we need to worry about? Or those things that we can actually, once you can describe a market share, the players, the participants, it's kind of like understood and it's not necessarily that important. And so it's a provocation to not rely so much on the rearview mirror.
Based on that, doing a provocation myself, the black swans are getting clearer or maybe darker?
So it's a good one. And I'm actually doing a talk in a few weeks' time on black swans and green swans. And, you know, you can have both, right? I would say that black swans is the biggest excuse joker cards that people use. Boards, CEOs, leadership teams, they can take black swans and say, it's a black swan. I think the reality is that if you look at what a black swan is from, Nassim Taleb, and it first came about because in Europe, there were only white swans, I think in the 16th century or something. And so for them, a black swan is something that you couldn't predict. It was impossible to know. You didn't know what you don't know. So when you think about black swans, they are meant to be absolutely unpredictable, complete outliers. So you need to prepare through resiliency. You can't predict them. And therefore, when you look at events where people say, it was a black swan, like the pandemic or AI growing or whatever, maybe there's signals they decided to ignore. Maybe there were elephants in the room they decided not to deal with. Maybe there were actions and decisions they decided not to worry about. Maybe they probabilized too much, took a small probability and ignored the exponential asymmetric outcomes. Instead of looking at the potential outcomes and the different scenarios, they probabilized a particular risk or outcome on one thing. And any deviation is a black swan. The reality is that people should be thinking about black jellyfish. Black jellyfish is, in science, when the seawater rises, it becomes more acid and warmer, and they're more jellyfish. So you have hotter water with climate change, more jellyfish, and that. And we understand that phenomenon. Suddenly, around the world, nuclear plants started breaking down because they got clogged up with jellyfish. And so black jellyfish, you need to think about the second, third order implication. You need to ask yourself, what if? What if this cascades into something else? Maybe seemingly unrelated that is interacting with that. And I think that black jellyfish are actually more dangerous because you think you understand the initial phenomena, you behave and predict based on what you observe. Okay, more jellyfish, fine, so what? And you don't think about the next order implications. And that's where you need to be anticipatory and think about what if and adaptive and not necessarily just shoot down the black swan because you ignored the signals that didn't ask yourself the right questions.
Roger, think about your career. You used to work in the financial sector, forgive me. And I would like to understand what triggered you this personal shift to study probability and future and things that are mostly unpredictable.
That's a very good one because you're right. I mean, I'm sitting here now telling you about, you can't predict this and that. And I come from an environment for 20 years where I was global head of mergers and acquisitions for tech. And where the only thing that mattered was data. Data, you would worship data like an oracle. And in that world, synergy calculations, EPS, the things you, Victor, and your teams at CNN Money spend a lot of time on, right? And in 2017, I was in London. I was running the M&A business for BNP Paribas for tech, advising CEOs, boards, and investors on their most strategic deals. And in 2017, I went to San Francisco to scale their business there. And I promised myself that I would go down the rabbit hole around understanding change better. Because I felt that the CEOs and the clients we were speaking to, what was keeping them up at night was no longer the plug-and-play playbook. Market share, new products, etc. That mattered, of course, but you could feel that disruption was becoming broader and not clear, and no longer the disruptive innovation we were talking about earlier. And I got very interested in that. So I studied complexity, I did courses on improvisation because surprise and change can be also improv. I studied foresight and futures, small courses, AI, design thinking. And when I put all that together over a few years, I actually realized, you know what? We are behaving as if the world is stable, predictable, linear, and controllable. I believe that it wasn't, and maybe it never was, but the cost of relying on that was going to be higher. No longer just like a 2001 tech crash or 2008 financial crash, and then 2 years later, things get back to normal. I was more and more concerned and interested in that. And so I realized that basically, while in the past, M&A might have seemed like the dream jobs and investment banking, and I did many deals here in Brazil on that, I was thinking, change is changing, and there's possibly more value for me and more interest in moving to the next phase of change. And even though it meant abandoning what I believed in for many years, I believed that all the data was the oracle. I believed that the analysts had the answer, the CEOs had the answer, that strategy was forward-looking, until I realized that it was actually quite short-sighted, quite narrow in a world where things are changing in different ways, and that maybe it would be more interesting to spend time on that.
Roger, I had like 30 questions more to make to you, but unfortunately our time is very short. I'd like to thank you again for this interview here in Brazil, to having this little time to talk with us here in CNN Money.
It's such a pleasure, Victor. Thank you so much. These are important topics for many people.
Thank you. E obrigado a você que nos acompanhou nesse CNN Money Entrevistas, edição especial com Roger Spitz.